So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. This is my first sort of learning and teaching conference. I've only ever presented my sort of cell and developmental biology work before, so first time for everything. What I'm going to present today is actually something that's quite similar, I think, in approach to what David and Kamara spoke about yesterday, in terms of a staff-student collaborative type approach to decolonising. We're perhaps not quite far along the path as they are. This is really work that we started about sort of 15 to 18 months ago in Durham. And just sort of introduction to our approaches. I'd be really interested to hear feedback on sort of, what you think we're doing well or less well, basically. I wanted to start, sorry, this isn't on present mode, is it? Okay. So I just want to start just by acknowledging the people who've been involved in this. So we have fantastic people on our biosciences working group on the academic staff side of things. Ari Sadnandam actually started this as Decolonising working group lead before he moved on to other roles in the university that led to me taking over as lead. Oh, sorry. Is that behaving now? Yeah. Yes, excellent. We've also had great support at the science faculty level with Jackie Robson coordinating. Our head of department's been very supportive in this. Kim Schreck from the Students' Union has also been very supportive, and particularly our student interns who've really driven a lot of this work. Most of all, Gina Vong, who was our initial intern, and it's a lot of the work that she's done that I'm going to talk about primarily today. So decolonising at Durham University was very much a student-driven initiative initially. So the Durham People of Colour Association and the Durham Students' Union really sort of lobbied and campaigned for this over a number of years and developed a manifesto. And they've got some fantastic resources actually on the Decolonisation Hub where they're trying to bring this together. And based on this, basically from the 21-22 academic year, the university started to engage with decolonising, giving some structure to that at the university and faculty level, with the aim of allowing students to drive research in decolonising and provide funded opportunities for them to do so that students can pursue their interests, can develop useful resources that will help reform the curriculum without it being exploitative of student labour, essentially. And so the structure they settled upon was the idea that we'd have one paid intern per faculty, who would have more of a coordinating, almost administrative role, bringing the different departments together so that it's not too many people working in isolation. And then 2 to 3 paid interns per department. And each department was to have a decolonising lead and potentially form a decolonising working group. So what I'm going to talk about now is how we've applied that in the biosciences, but I just want to acknowledge that, as other people have said, this does sometimes attract somewhat negative attention in elements of particularly sort of the more right-wing press. So it's something we're aware of and something we need to consider, I think, particularly in ensuring that our students aren't sort of excessively exposed sort of online pylons and so on related to this, in how we sort of coordinate that. So I'm going to focus today on our Department of Biosciences work. I just want to briefly introduce the department, just to say that we are in some ways a fairly large department. We're about 50 to 60 academic staff and around 170 to 200 students per year group, but we're very broad, so each individual sort of area is quite sort of compact. So we go all the way from the biomolecular, biochemistry, structural biology, up to ecology, evolution and environment. And I'm actually from the animal cells and systems grouping. My own area of research is actually in stem cell biology and developmental biology. So really starting this at the beginning of last academic year, we really had the question of just where to begin, because we're all very much sort of mostly research active scientists. We don't really have a great deal of expertise in this. We're learning sort of as we go, essentially. And so what we want to do is get an idea of the student perspective and find out what our students think about decolonising and how they feel about representation in the department. And so our first intern, Gina Vong, designed a decolonisation survey aimed at our students. And we distributed this in December of last year. Kept it running for about 6 weeks, so right over the sort of the Christmas vacation into the start of the next term. It was heavily advertised through our student reps and through our staff student consultative committee, emails from me as decolonising lead, supported by head of department, and also emails from Gina as sort of student lead on this, to try and sort of, and Gina was also very good at sort of putting up advertising around the department, generating QR codes that could be added onto the end of lecture slides and so on. And we're able to get 92 responses. Our student body is somewhere in the region of 450 to 500, And if we include natural scientists who do some biology modules, it probably goes up to 700. So we're somewhere in the 15 to 20% response rate, which I think isn't a bad sampling, but I think we have to be aware that obviously there is a degree of selection here in terms of who is going to respond to this. We're likely to get the people with the most extreme views in both directions. So that's something we're aware of. Amongst those responses, we had quite a good distribution across our year groups. Our fourth year is slightly smaller than the other years. Our placement students tend to be perhaps less engaged with what's going on in the department during their year away. And a fairly representative spread across our topic areas as well. The plant grouping among students is probably slightly smaller. The sort of the more biomedical, biomolecular interactions, animal cells and systems dominate. So a decent representation from across our modules and subject areas. We did do some demographic data. The majority of respondents were home students, as defined in terms of sort of fees and so on. And we did have some demographic information about ethnicity as well, asking people to sort of define themselves. The proportions here are probably not a million miles off representative of what our department is. The majority of our department is sort of white British students at Durham. So we asked students what they understand by the term decolonisation. And we got some really sort of great responses, so some really good understanding from a proportion of students, certainly. A lot about sort of bias and particularly the idea of sort of white dominance, Western dominance came across very strongly in the responses. A prevalent sort of set of response, though, was along the lines of almost nothing or absolutely nothing or relatively little, suggesting that this isn't something we're perhaps engaging very much within our curriculum at the moment and raising awareness of, and also suggesting that this isn't something that students are encountering at school level either, when they're studying biology before they come to university, which I think is interesting in terms of how we think about curriculum development. Do we need to find ways of getting these kind of messages, these kind of understanding to students rather earlier in their academic careers? We also have some slightly more quantitative questions about student views of representation and inclusion. And you can see here very clearly that in terms of staff, student and guest speaker representation, we're not seen as a very sort of representative department. And I think that's accurate in terms of the actual numbers. And certainly we've got a fantastic EDI team in the department who are doing a lot of work, and indeed at sort of the university level, who do a lot of work about sort of recruitment and so on and changes to those processes to try and improve this. But obviously that's not sort of a quick solution that's going to happen overnight. Guest speaker representation, again, is something that our EDI committee are working on. And we're working, I think, very hard on sort of creating sort of frameworks for sort of speaker invitations to make sure that we are inviting a more diverse range of speakers. That is something that I think we can act on rather more quickly. One encouraging take home was that we are viewed as having an inclusive learning environment. So there is some positivity there in terms of the way we're teaching people feeling able to contribute to the department. But in terms of acknowledgement of representation issues in the curriculum, we dive back down, suggesting there is a need for more representation, more diversification of our curriculum. We asked about what the biggest decolonisation issues students felt were in the department. A lot of this was about sort of representation in staff in particular and who is delivering the material. And there was also the need to sort of address, engage with issues rather more and more deeply, actually was something that came across in a lot of these responses. So I think the department is viewed broadly as very inclusive, but not very representative, perhaps. Representation in the curriculum was seen as quite poor. But what was encouraging was that from these responses, the free text responses, there was very broad support for decolonising the curriculum, at least among respondents. There were a few negative comments, but they were very much in the minority. It was a very small number that we were seeing of negative comments, which is encouraging. We asked for suggestions, the ways in which the department could decolonise. And we saw a lot of response on this, some relating to sort of staff recruitment, some relating to sort of guest speakers and so on. Some very specific examples in terms of dealing with eugenics and race as an issue. And generally, actually, when we look through the free text response, if we try and boil this down to what were students really sort of asking for and looking for, it really comes down to the ideas of diversification and contextualization. So what it seems our students are looking for is increased representation across the curriculum, which is this idea that people have been talking about of people being able to see themselves in the curriculum and see the range of people who are doing science and the types of science being done as well. But also contextualization, where we go perhaps more in depth and a sort of a less shallow approach where we're looking at difficult histories and present inequalities in science. How long do we leave it as a test?
Could have messaged Daniela and see if they've got it as well. Well, that's unfortunate, isn't it? I guess
We should probably leave the building.
vacate the building.
Oh, no, I said it's just a test.
It's just,
Because it's just what I learned it and so you need to leave. Okay, bear with. That monitor, is that displaying anything?
Sorry.
So apparently we don't need to leave.
it's okay, it's all right, everybody. You don't need to. Not actually alarm, just the test apparently, that's what Catherine should meant to me.
Very thorough.
Yes.
Oh.
A little bit, hasn't it?
Oh, that's all right, don't worry. I've got ringing in ears now. Right.
Get that out of the video.
Okay, hopefully we're still broadcasting. So our students are looking for sort of diversification, sort of on quite a broad scale across all of our modules, but also where relevant, sort of more contextualization about both historical aspects and current aspects of inequality and bias. So having consulted the students, we then want to ask where our staff are starting from this. And this is partly in terms of judging how we pitch this and how we take this forward. So what do our staff think about decolonising and how can we best support curriculum reform? What do staff need to progress with this? So we conducted a staff survey. Again, this was led by Gina. We had 26 responses to this. This is from a teaching staff of around 50, 55. So it's about half the department replied to this. And again, obviously there's an element of self-selection in that. We had a good spread from across our different sort of teaching areas and across our teaching years. There are more people who teach on years sort of 2 and 3 than any others, which is why those slices are bigger. But there's a good representation here that straddles essentially all of our modules, I think, in terms of teaching. We asked what people understand by the term decolonisation, and there was a lot of good ideas, good suggestions here around how you would interpret this in terms of contextualization, diversification. Acknowledging biases in particular was a big thing that came out from staff interpretations of this. We asked similar questions about representation and inclusion with slightly different wording. And we saw one thing that was encouraging actually was we see very similar alignment actually in a lot of these responses between what our staff are seeing and what our students are seeing. So I think there's a lot of alignment there, which I think is very helpful in terms of taking this forward. So in terms of representation, similar kind of responses. There was a slightly more sort of positive or at least neutral view of acknowledgement of representation issues in the curriculum amongst staff. And that may be partly self-selection in terms of the staff who are sort of thinking about these issues already and incorporating them in their teaching are probably more likely to respond to the survey. So that might be the explanation for the skew there. And again, staff find the department broadly welcoming and inclusive. We asked people about decolonising practices within their own research and teaching. And this is actually acted as quite a nice pool of ideas that we could potentially develop down the line for things that could be taught in more depth. So everything from sort of HeLa cells, which were obtained without consent from Henrietta Lacks, right through to sort of eugenics questions and so on that people are either already addressing or thinking about addressing, and that's either related to their research in sort of the top cloud up here or more sort of related to their teaching in the bottom cloud. And there was a lot about people already trying to sort of diversify the examples of the scientists they talk about. And show, particularly, I think, sort of following some Athena Swan work in the department, I think there's been more of an emphasis on sort of inclusion of men and women more equally across the department in terms of examples shown. And I think trying to broaden that out to sort of to minoritized groups in science and underrepresented groups in science more generally. And we asked about biggest challenges, and a lot here actually came down to either staff predominates in terms of this is a lot about staff expertise, staff time, and I think having access to the kinds of materials and training and whether or not staff are expert enough in some of these issues to be able to teach them, which I think is a genuine sort of concern in terms of how we do this. Suggestions for decolonising, I'm not going to dwell on because I'm sort of slightly tight on time. But there were a lot of suggestions here, some very specific, focusing on specific areas we could be teaching and maybe aren't, or more general sort of principles in the way we engage with things in the department. And so I think we can generally summarize this to sort of break it down a little bit into, again, staff like students broadly. Should I admit that? Are you able to admit? Yeah, excellent. Departments broadly viewed as inclusive, but representation in the curriculum is seen as generally poor. It's amongst the staff responding, it was somewhat neutral, but there was a skew towards poor a little bit. One thing that was clear was that most staff are very open to decolonising, but need more support, possibly sort of training, and that time is an issue in terms of balancing. The majority of our staff are research active. We are quite research intensive at Durham, and it's difficult, I think, finding the time for teaching work and making sure that there is the time and workload models and so for that. In terms of suggested curriculum changes, actually, staff generally provided more sort of specific examples, I would say, than students, because obviously they're maybe more embedded with their own materials, but it still boiled down to a lot about increasing diversification of examples, both in terms of the people doing the science who were showcasing and the types of science that we're showcasing and where it's being done. And also contextualization, so engaging more deeply with issues and histories and the current biases. Finally, we asked staff what kinds of resources or support would be most useful. Flashcards of concepts and terms were not very popular. What people really wanted was development of case studies that either they could use or be inspired by, and also an ideas database that they can dip into, which I think is very similar to what a lot of other people have found in their polling, and the types of resources that other departments have been developing that we've had some really great talks on. There was some support, more consultation and discussion groups as well. So what we've tried to do is, running parallel to this, we had our other student interns starting to develop projects, and we were thinking around these kind of resource type issues. I don't have time to talk about them in detail today, but we had 3 fantastic student interns who worked on different kinds of projects. So Maddie developed some posters about scientists from minoritized backgrounds, showcasing them, which we are hoping to display around the department and make more publicly available as a web resource as well. And that's something that we hope that we can build on, and that future projects might add additional posters to, and think about putting this into different formats for web use and so on as well. Abdul developed the first few episodes of a fantastic podcast series. He's a wonderful communicator, talking about defining decolonising and some interesting case studies that he'd found from particular papers. So there's a couple of fantastic podcasts that he developed on that, which are available actually through our Durham University Decolonisation Hub. Those are linked through. And Natasha Ali started to work on a reading list, primarily aimed at either staff or students, but on the more accessible, more popular science kind of level for the most part, but also some journal articles as well. So for example, Rebecca Sloot's fantastic book on Henrietta Lacks as a social history of science. And also some Adam Rutherford's work, his more recent book on eugenics, and his How to Argue with a Racist book as well. It's a lot about race science, which are some of the issues we discussed yesterday. So those are student projects. We are also, I'm conscious of time, we've also tried to get staff to start to develop their own case studies. I'll be brief on this. Oh, I'm all right. Okay, cool. So we want to encourage staff to develop case studies around their own teaching and work. And so what we've tried to do is start with the working group, and each member of the working group's tried to come up with case studies from their own teaching, where there's something that either they're already doing or feel they're not engaging with well enough, or would like advice and improvements on. And this was actually inspired by staff coming to us with examples of, this has come up in my teaching, we're not sure how to deal with it. And then as a working group trying to sound things out and act almost a inexpert, but pool mind consultation body. And this is actually one from my own teaching. So I teach second year developmental biology as one of my modules. I'm a Drosophila biologist, and I teach a lot of the history of invertebrate developmental biology and what we've learned particularly from flies and worms. And so I do the history of those fields going back all the way to Thomas Hunt Morgan's fly lab at Columbia in the 1910s, 1920s. And I like to tell historical stories and anecdotes in my teaching. I think students engage very well with that, but I'm very aware that I am putting people on pedestals and showcasing people who may not be very diverse, but also putting anybody on a pedestal is not the way science is actually done, and it's not acknowledging that team effort. Nonetheless, I think there is value in talking about some of these individuals and trying to contextualize them. I certainly don't want to remove them from my teaching and play into narratives about this being about cancel culture. We want it, as several people said, to be about adding to the curriculum and enriching it. So what I've been grappling with is how to contextualize the associations of Hunt Morgan and Muller with eugenics. And something that I've become very aware of in this is that I'm not a historian. My wife actually is a historian, who makes me very aware that I'm not a historian. And so I think it is something that I think is very challenging, is as scientists, how we engage with this so that we're not engaging with history in a very peripheral surface way, in a way that we would never do with our own science that we're teaching. So how do we as scientists start to teach bits of history in a balanced way is actually very challenging in terms of the resources we choose and so on. And that's something I don't have good answers to. And I'm hoping to start reaching out actually to people in our history faculty and other history faculties for people who truly are experts in some of these areas. Because I think there is dangers there, I think, in how we go about this as scientists and whether we're applying the same level of academic rigor to our history as we are to our science. So with something that I found very useful in terms of eugenics is this eugenics archive site that was a project that ran from 2010 to 2015 in Canada, where they've developed a huge pool of resources about eugenics and its association with modern genetics. And they've got fantastic profiles of some of these scientists, acknowledging their achievements, but also how they intersected with the eugenics movement. And so I've been using resources from there as a starting point. And where I think there is an opportunity with these two in particular, Muller was a very prominent advocate of eugenics. He really actively wrote in support of eugenic policies at the political level, whereas Hunt Morgan briefly joined some of the American eugenics societies in 1905, but left almost immediately after a year, and then wrote very vociferously about how this was not good science and about how we can't interpret complex phenotypes at the level of the gene based on his own studies of heredity. So I think there's an interesting example there, which I need to explore more of the full historical context of the idea that there's often pushback on the grounds of this was how everybody thought at that time, is often a pushback you hear. But here you've got a prominent scientist who was actively writing and pushing back and saying this is poor science, which I think relates a lot to sort of issues we see contemporarily today in terms of scientists perhaps being worried about engaging with modern politics. But actually there's a real need there to not leave a gap where other people can define our terms and write their own narratives around this. So that's one thing I'm grappling with at the moment and trying to improve my own teaching on. Another is this will be very brief, we have a module called Contemporary Issues in the Biosciences, where students write, it's almost like sort of a consultancy type report, where they go away and do research as a group. So sort of 5 or 6 members in a team doing their own independent research that then has to come together to form a group presentation that cohesively addresses the question and share their research with each other. And then there are individual reports. And so I've worked in this module for a while. I've generally set questions about personalized medicine and sort of more in my own expertise around genetics and cancer treatment. But this year I just point blank set the question of how do we decolonize the biosciences? And so I don't have the full student results from this or full sort of permissions from the students to talk about this generally, but I very deliberately left this open so they could pursue elements of curriculum or research, historical elements or current biases. And so I'm really interested to see where they take this and how they develop their topics around this area. Moving forward, we're currently recruiting 3 new interns for this year. We're literally in the middle of the interview process, finishing that off tomorrow morning. And what we've tried to do at a faculty level is have this more organized this year, because it's our 2nd year running. We've learned lessons a bit from last year. We now have training and support coordinated by the Students' Union. So all of the interns will be trained together. They'll be brought together so they can interact with each other across the departments and the faculty and have a bigger support network. And we're very conscious that aside from sort of potential criticism and online sort of attacks and so on that may come down the line, these are challenging issues that students are engaging with. I personally have a lot of privilege. I don't have a lot of lived experience of these issues, but some of our students researching this probably will. And so we need to make sure that they have links to appropriate support resources and people to reach out to where they do encounter difficulties and problems and find this challenging. So that's something that the Students' Union developed a lot of. And we've actually just recruited a new faculty intern who will coordinate across departments and provide support for the interns and give them some guidance. We're continuing to develop staff case studies. We have a teaching away day every summer, and the focus this year was on decolonising. So we gave a variant of this talk, and then we had sort of breakout sessions where around each of our 4 research and teaching themes, people talked about stuff they're already doing as a group, just to get a conversation going. And we're starting to pull information from that about what's already happening that's sort of good practice, and where there's opportunities to develop more. And we hope to target student projects, student driven around their own interests, but fitting into some of that and starting to fill gaps in the curriculum. We're trying to engage with more, and things we're dwelling on is how we ensure sustainability of this process. And I can't actually see past Zoom what my final point was. So how we ensure sustainability, and how we assess progress as well was the other thing, in terms of sort of resurveying in the future and so on. So thank you, I'm overrunning a little bit.
Thanks very much, David. Has anyone got any questions for David? So online or in the room?
Question if there is anybody else. This is not necessarily directly related to what you're presenting. It's kind of like a bigger question, I guess. we're currently going through a curriculum review at Warwick, and a couple of people are leading the curriculum review have a notion that we shouldn't be teaching history. So, like, oh, we tend to be teaching a sort of, you know, the history of science, whereas we need to kind of focus on, you know, the science more so in terms of future development, etc. What would you say to people that have that opinion? Because it seems from pretty much all of our discussions is that actually we do need to be addressing the history of this. What would you say?
I mean, I think that letting the science drive that is helpful, because I think that view of kind of, you know, we're presenting the current scientific truth. I think if we want our students to think critically about science, never mind history, they need to know where that's come from in terms of what experiments have been done and how our current models of different areas of science have been developed. So I think in order to teach that well, I think we have to engage with where those models have come from. So I think that requires us to teach the history of the doing of the science, at least. And then I think it's very natural to contextualize that more broadly as we go. And I think if students know how science has been done, where it's come from, I think they're more likely to better understand our current models, and also move away from that idea of sort of rigid facts of a journal says this, therefore it's true. Because I've given lectures where I present current conflicting views of things, and I've had emails after lecture saying, you know, you've presented these two different viewpoints, which one's right? And that's about sort of current debate in the literature. So I think if we don't embed how science has been done, how models have changed, how models of different processes have changed over time, then our students don't have that depth of understanding of how we know what we know, how science is done. And it naturally lets you sort of then sort of expand out from that a bit. Yeah.
I've got another question online from Malia. So she'd like to ask what funding streams were accessed for the internships, whether it's specific to Durham or from outside groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're fortunate that what has happened is the University Council approved funding for those studentships. So each internship, so each internship is funded for, we can either have 3 50-hour paid student internships or 2 75-hour paid student internships. And the faculty ones, I think, might be 150 hours, sort of double that to span the whole academic year. And the students are very flexible in terms of how they do that. They can, depending on what year group they're in, we're hoping to appoint students in early January. They'll have the whole last 2 terms to use those 75 hours how they see best, essentially, to fit around their studies. And we've been very fortunate, actually, in our department, I should have mentioned, that our department actually matched that faculty funding, so we were able to double the number of interns we recruited as a department. So our department have taken this seriously, which has been very, very helpful.
Question online from Aminam. In your module feedback, what were some challenges that you and students have experienced? Also, how would you motivate who wishes to just know the information required to pass rather than learning to be global scientists?
That's a massive question. So on the first bit, challenges from our students, in terms of pushback, we did get some of sort of the things that other people have flagged in terms of science is about empirical fact, or sort of, you know, it is just a fact that all of the science that we build on today was done by white middle-aged men. And I think that is an opportunity there where clearly we are not being broad enough in sort of moving students away from that and showing people a breadth of range of examples. So I think there's an opportunity there to sort of widen people's perspectives. The how not to teach the testing, I think, is incredibly hard. I really don't have an answer in terms of where to start with. Actually, it's so broad, and it's extremely challenging where you have students who very much just want to graduate with their 2-1 first class degree and move into perhaps a different field. I think that's really difficult, and I guess it's just, I think one thing is with sort of diversifying, contextualizing, I think you're broadening the curriculum, and hopefully you're finding things that might be of interest to more people. I think the more you broaden things, the more you might just catch someone's imagination by having different and diverse aspects in there. So that might be slightly sort of naive and idealistic, but I would hope that the act of diversifying might actually help people maybe get more excited and engage with their studies.
Great, thank you very much. Fantastic.